All eyes are now on U.S. President Donald Trump's meeting with Russian President Vladimir Putin in Alaska this Friday for Ukraine peace talks. But Trump's claim of an economic windfall from higher tariff collections ahead of that meeting seems to be playing another narrative. In July, the U.S. budget deficit jumped 20% from a year earlier to $291 billion, despite a record surge in tariff revenues. The U.S. is now facing its worst ever debt crisis, with the total debt reaching $37 trillion for the first time. The total U.S. debt has surged by $780 billion. That's since Trump's administration raised the debt ceiling after the One Big Beautiful Bill Act, which was signed into a law on July 4th. This amounts to a staggering $22 billion every day on average. Just last week, the government auctioned $724 billion worth of treasuries. 3 of those auctions says tippy demand, with investors asking for higher yield that reflects the risk of the U.S. debt crisis. This comes when Trump has raised average U.S. tariffs to above 20% from about 2% before he took the office in January. Interestingly, the U.S. attempts to force Russia's hands through sanctions on Moscow's oil, which has not really materialized as planned. When hostilities between Russia and Ukraine broke out in 2022, the U.S. and its allies had hopes that the Russian economy, dependent on oil and gas exports, would collapse and the conflict would end. Oil and energy revenues make up for 20% of the Russian economy, with exports to Europe marking the biggest share. However, the impact from the U.S. and European allies' policies to end Russia's so-called war machinery has been limited at best. The Russian economy has hummed along nicely since the war, despite a few temporary blips in the economy. All that the sanctions have done is perhaps redraw Moscow's trading ties and bring the BRICS nations closer. India and China have stood their ground on Russian purchases despite Trump's high tariff threat. At the same time, the U.S. economy too has hummed along strongly, but the boost to the economy is coming from huge debt and not strong fundamentals. That is now reflected in the record surge in U.S. debt and in the investors' tippy demand for treasuries at auctions in recent weeks.